Hi, how are you? Usually when I sit down to make a video to put here on social media, I'm concentrating on something theological. But today, I want to do a little bit of commentary, which I don't normally do because there are enough people out here doing that. And to be honest with you, opinions are indeed like belly buttons. Everybody has one. And I'm not sure that everybody sharing their opinion has sort of earned the right to have an opinion that everybody else needs to be subjected to. But that's another topic. I have been asked ever since the beginning of this whole pandemic thing what I thought. How was this affecting the church? Both GCA here locally and the church generally, the church at large, the church in the world. And I didn't want to say anything about it initially because I wanted to wait and see what the fallout was actually going to be. Because initially, everybody reacted in an almost knee-jerk fashion. And justifiably so. We didn't know what we were dealing with. And we were getting a lot of different opinions and information coming our way very, very quickly. And so there were churches who, believing that they were doing the loving thing, believing that they were doing the obedient thing, and that they were trying to be good members of the larger society, there are churches that closed their doors entirely and then went online. Whether they were doing it well or not, they just suddenly had to get online. And I think we've all seen church recordings of church services that were done poorly, where you can't really hear or understand what's going on. And we've seen some that were done very well, primarily by churches that were already broadcasting on a fairly professional level. We here at GCA opted not to close our doors. And I took a fair amount of pushback for that. I was asked things like, well, don't you love your congregation? Wouldn't that be the healthy thing to do? Are you actually following biblical dictates by not closing your doors? First off, I realize that we're very fortunate. We're here in Smyrna, Tennessee. And because we're in this pocket of Middle Tennessee where COVID wasn't quite as large an issue as it was in major cities, we were able to keep the doors of GCA open. But theologically, the reason that I was determined to keep the doors open is that for 20 years we have been saying that God is absolutely sovereign in all things. He's in control of all things. That being the case, I couldn't justify the idea that we would shut the doors, not congregate, and not give God his proper worship when, after all, he's the God who's in charge of everything. And that includes disease. I have said for so many years, God is in charge of every planet and every star, which he calls by name. The whole of creation was made by him and for him, and all to his glory. And there are no random cells or atoms anywhere in his universe. Everything ultimately serves him and serves his purpose. And so that God, that sovereign God, who is in charge of disease, I couldn't understand why we would not go worship him out of fear of getting a disease that ultimately he's in charge of. Now, I certainly wasn't saying if we worship God, then we can guarantee that none of us are going to get sick. Here at GCA, we have had a few people who have gotten sick with COVID, with various levels of symptoms. Some had no symptoms at all, even though they had a positive test. And some quarantined for a couple of weeks because they actually were sick, but they had caught the sickness outside of GCA. My contention is that rational people do rational things, and so my request of everybody at GCA was, if you're sick, stay home. If you need to quarantine, quarantine. Don't come and pass it around to other folk. But I would say the same thing if you had the flu, or if you had even a really bad upper respiratory virus of any type. I would say, well, don't infect other people. I also have not been against wearing masks. We have a box of masks at the door at GCA, and if people choose to wear them, they can. And in the early days, a fair number did. I'm the same way about vaccines. I say, if you want to take the vaccine, take the vaccine. If that's what gives you peace of mind, then take the vaccine. I myself have a lot of questions about the vaccine, and I have not yet subjected myself to it. But again, I'm a long-term kind of thinker. Let's see what happens long-term. At some point in the future, I may decide that that's a good idea. Or depending on what the outcome is, I will realize that long-term, I made the right choice. I like to wait and see how it plays out. And that's really the point of this video. What have I observed about the church with these large churches especially that have shut down and then gone online? I talked a couple of weeks ago to a friend of mine up in New York, and granted, Long Island is very, very different than Smyrna, Tennessee. Because the government had requested that churches close their door, he agreed. And he closed his door and he started doing his teaching online. Well, just a couple of months ago, he began reopening the church, began gathering again in the sanctuary, began having public services. And I asked him, so how is that going? And he said, they're not coming back. I've had some people say to me that they prefer to just listen to the teaching, watch the service online. Okay, there's one of the long-term effects of what happens when the church shuts its doors and then goes online, because people, after the leadership of the church, and they may have done it, as I said, they may have done it for very valid reasons initially. This is what they were being asked to do. This is what they thought was the proper approach. Out of love for their people, they thought this was the right approach. But then people sitting at home, watching church online, naturally they start thinking that this must be a good substitute for actually congregating. I mean, after all, the church has approved it. The church is doing it. Some churches have done it for more than a year now. And so, watching online, just dialing up a video, is apparently the same. It's tantamount to actually going to church. But of course, if you're doing church online, there are a lot of things that you just simply cannot do, like congregate. So it's no longer a congregation. You no longer pray as a congregation. You no longer are benefiting from the sacraments of the church on any kind of regular basis. And you're certainly not getting the fellowship and the Christian camaraderie that comes from being in church. And as a consequence of a year now, well, actually more, a year though, of people watching church online, what has happened psychologically is that people watching church, instead of being a congregation, have become an audience. They're not participant, they're viewers. They're just watching it online. And the advantage of watching church instead of actually attending church is that you can watch it whenever you want. You don't have to get up on Sunday morning. You don't have to watch it when it's live. You can watch it later. You can watch it Sunday afternoon. You can watch it on Tuesday. You can watch it whenever you want, and that technically becomes going to church. And if you need to pause it or go make a sandwich or anything, you can do that because after all, it's just another thing on the internet. It's another video that you're viewing, and it's separate from you. You're not really invested in it. So, do the numbers bear that out? I think they do. You see, I also am online, but GCA has been online for a very long time. I realized that the internet was going to be the future mode of communication for the vast majority of the world, and I figured that out more than 20 years ago. And so we started recording our services and then putting them up online a long time ago, which is why GCA has such an extensive archive, because we've been recording, making MP3s, and posting those online. Now, granted, what we do at GCA works really well online because it's teaching, and we only broadcast that part of the service that is the teaching element. Sometimes we include some songs, sometimes we include a prayer here and there, but it is primarily a teaching ministry which works really well online. If you're putting church services up online and you're trying to include everything, then, like I said, folks online watching it become an audience to it instead of a participant in it. And I found out years ago, when I was out in Los Angeles, I was part of a large TV ministry, and I worked in their TV ministry. And there were just certain things that I discovered even way back then. Like, for instance, you cannot pastor people over television. You can't pastor them through a TV camera or a webcam like I'm talking to right now. It's impossible to pastor to people when you're not actually involved in their life, when you're not hearing from them directly, looking them in the eye, feeling their feelings with them, feeling their pain and feeling their happiness and their elation, and knowing what the circumstances of their life are in a larger world context, in a larger life context. It's impossible then to actually pastor people. You can teach people. You can instruct people. You can bring people along in the doctrines of the Bible. But I tell people all the time, if you're listening to GCA, make sure that you are also looking for a local church to be part of. Don't just come to the internet exclusively to get your Bible teaching. You also need Bible community. You also need Christian fellowship. You need to be part of a congregation. Okay, now I said a moment ago that the numbers bear it out. Churches closed their doors. Some of the churches were quite large. Here in Smyrna, we have a mega church, I guess you could call it that. It's a very large church. They were having 2, sometimes 3 services on Sunday mornings, which means that they were seeing a lot of people pass through their doors, into the hundreds, perhaps into the thousands of people that passed through their doors. And then, because they did broadcast in a professional way, and they did have cameras and good sound and lighting and everything else, when they were forced to go online, they were able to do it and do it well. And then over time, their numbers dwindled. Not their numbers in church, their numbers online. I've been watching it. I've been looking at the Facebook numbers, even though I'm not sure that I completely trust that viewing algorithm. But I've been watching the YouTube numbers. I've been watching the live broadcast numbers. And then I go back and check those numbers after a number of months so that everybody who is going to watch that particular service has already watched it. And the numbers are dwindling. Why? Well, I spoke to one girl who used to be a member of the megachurch I'm speaking of. And she said, yeah, we went online, and so I started watching church online, and I started watching on Sunday mornings. And then after a while, it became Sunday afternoons. Then after a while, it became sometime during the week, and if I'm being honest with you, at this point, I'm a couple months behind. You see, there's no obligation, there's no involvement when you're just looking at something online. It's just another kind of entertainment. You become an audience to yet another online video. And my fear has come true, which is people now treat church online the same way that they treat every other video that's online. Whether that's cats playing piano or somebody falling down in a funny way, that's just another video online that you can watch. And that's what online church has become in so many situations and circumstances. Now, is there an upside to that? Yeah, absolutely. I am convinced that God is sifting out his church. He's weeding out dedicated from undedicated people and churches. What I mean by that is, there were people who went to church simply because it was, it's what you do. After all, we're here in the South. We're right here in a notch of the Bible Belt. And so people go to church. But they never really gave too much thought about the church that they went to. Oftentimes it was the right denomination and it was close by. And so that's the church I'm a member of. And they would go to the church and they would sit through the services, whatever those services happened to be, and whatever teaching happened to be going on from the pulpit. And then church went online. And now church has to compete with everything else that's online to get the attention of people and hold their attention. Because after all, they can click away. They can find something else to watch that's more entertaining. As a consequence, I think I know people who used to go to church and just be there have now found that when they sit and watch the video and try to listen to what's actually being said, to see if it actually informs them or enriches them, if it actually gains their attention and keeps their attention, they're finding out that much of the teaching that's being done in those churches is actually pretty milquetoast, is actually pretty vacuous, isn't solidly Bible, and is full of sports analogies and fishing stories. That's the phrase that I've used for years to say that so many preachers are not really preaching. They're certainly not preaching the Bible. What they're doing is just talking. And you can find people who will talk to you just about anywhere. Well, you put all that together, and what you get is exactly what's happening at this very moment, which is people are not paying attention to the church they were once a part of. People are dropping off from actually listening to videos and listening to church services online. And people who once attended the church, now that the church doors are open, are not coming back, especially because they believe that they can just sit at home and watch church, and that's kind of punched their ticket. They're good for another week. They went to church because, after all, they watched at least part of a video. And I think this is a consequence of closing the doors of the church and then going online as if that is a reasonable substitute for congregating in church. And then God is, in fact, sifting out, shaking out the church, and whatever can be shaken is getting shaken because people are not coming back. They're out scattered. They're out wandering. They've gotten used to not going to church, and then they got used to not watching church, and then they got used to not having church in their lives, and that just became habit. The writer of Hebrews warned that you got to be careful not to let the truth of the gospel, the things that we have learned, not to let them slip away. And I think that's happening in far too many circumstances. So, a year ago, March, I met with the leaders at GCA, and I said, essentially what I said earlier in this video, that I can't theologically make sense of the notion that we should shut the doors for fear of a disease that our sovereign God is in charge of. I contend that we still ought to meet and worship him. After all, as Job said, arguably the oldest book in the Old Testament, as Job said, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. And Job knew something about going through sickness and disease. And based on what the Bible says over and over again about the necessity of worshiping God, and that he is worthy of our worship, and that Christianity, we're told by Jesus, Christianity has a cost to it. Being a disciple of Christ, count the cost, he says. So knowing all of that biblically, I think that we should put our bodies on the line, continue to worship God as is appropriate, and to worship him because our whole lives and our health and our ability to get up in the morning and know our own names, all of that is wrapped up in the grace, the kindness, and the benefits that accrue from our sovereign God. So how do we justify closing the doors of GCA and not worshiping the God who we're counting on every single day, every single moment, and the one who is in charge of whether we get sick or not? I say we keep gathering, keep singing, keep praying, keep looking into his word, and then keep putting the MP3s out just as we always have. Now, I've had a few folks ask me, well, now that everybody's going online with video, how come you're not live streaming? How come you're not doing video of your services? And there are actually a couple answers to that question. First off, as you can already see, I have a great face for radio. There's nobody who's benefited by seeing my silly mug. I'm more interested in them hearing what it is we're proclaiming. I'm more interested in them hearing what we're talking about. And for better than 20 years, the method of making MP3s, putting them on our website, distributing them around the internet, that's worked really, really well for us. Because it's also very portable, and people listen to us in the car or working around the kitchen or on treadmills in a gym somewhere. They can listen to us wherever they are. And I think that the teaching and the content and the biblical doctrine, if that's not sufficient to keep your attention, then this face is going to do it for you? I don't think so. So it's this much longer, what, a year and a half that we're into this? Into this 2 weeks to make sure that we didn't overcrowd the hospitals? We're a year and a half into it now. And God is still in charge of it. He's still sovereign over it. and he is still doing whatever pleases him. And he is using these circumstances to sort out his church. And he is preparing the world for what's to come. I mentioned a few weeks ago that prior to March 2000, when you read things like no man's going to be able to buy, sell, or trade unless he takes the mark, whatever that means, and whatever you think that means, it was hard to imagine before March 2020. People would say, well, not me. I'm not going to take the mark. I mean, I'm an independent person. I'm a free citizen. I don't have to go take that mark. I'll just get off the grid. I'll just go live on my own, and they won't find me. And now, after everything we've been through, between masking and vaccines and talk of vaccine passports and people being trapped in places they didn't want to be trapped in. Now, as a result of all that, we can fully imagine a circumstance, especially with the advent of digital money. We can certainly see where no man can buy, sell, or trade unless they conform, take the mark. Now, am I saying that masks are the mark? No, I'm not saying anything like that. Are vaccines the mark? No. But it is all preparing the way. And if you get nothing else out of this little moment of commentary, just recognize that everything that is happening right now in the world is proving that the Bible, yet again, is accurate. How did John know 2,000 years ago, when he was writing the book of Revelation, that there was going to be a circumstance on the horizon where no man was going to be able to buy, sell, or trade unless he conformed and took the mark? How did he know that? It is yet again proof that the Bible's true. And that is why here at GCA we concentrate on teaching the Bible. Talk to you again soon.